Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our first keynote of the summit with Tom Chi on Ag's possible future for food and materials. My name is Maria King, and I'm a first-year MBA student at the Tech School. Before I introduce Tom, just a quick reminder that you can ask questions via the Ask a Question button below our video stream. All participants can see and react to the questions, so feel free to upvote questions that you like, and pending time at the end, we'll get through as many as we can. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce Tom Chi, who is a veteran of the Ag Tech Summit, having presented last year, and we're super grateful he agreed to join us again this year. Tom Chi has worked in roles ranging from astrophysical researcher to Fortune 500 consultant to corporate executive developing hardware and software products and services. He pioneered and practices a unique approach to rapid prototyping and leadership that can jumpstart innovative new ideas and move large organizations at unprecedented speeds. He was head of product experience and a founding member of Google X, and currently works to accelerate a future where humanity becomes a net positive to nature. On this front, he recently launched At One Ventures, where he's a founding partner, which is dedicated to this thesis. And with that, Tom, please take it away.
All right. Hey, everybody. Good morning, or I guess it's the middle of the day for you. We're going to jump right in. So agriculture, if you consider agriculture a single industry, it's the industry that has the largest ecological footprint by a lot. Just quickly running down the line, there's a lot of press that's given to energy production around greenhouse gases, that we need to move to wind and solar, and that's really critical for greenhouse gas reduction. But energy production does about 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and agriculture does 26%. So they're effectively on par. If you cared about renewable energy because of the carbon impact, then you should definitely be paying attention to agriculture as well, because the carbon impact is the greenhouse gas impact, because there's also enteric methane. The greenhouse gas impact is on par. Another thing that no other industry does is that agriculture uses half of the habitable land on the planet. It uses 70% of the fresh water that we use. So, and it is the main driver of eutrophication. So, kind of the excess nitrates and phosphates that then create problems in our rivers and oceans and lakes. And lastly, in terms of biodiversity, we're effectively changing the entire planet into an animal farm. So Jonathan Safran Foer wrote a book called We Are the Weather. And in it, he basically sets this metaphor of, we kind of imagine the Industrial Revolution of turning the world into a factory, like a within four walls, machines turning inside. But what we've actually done by the year 2020 is we've turned it into an animal farm. 94% of mammals on the planet are livestock. If you go to avian biomass, it's about 75 to 80% is poultry of some type. 20% is all the other birds. And yeah, pretty much the majority of stuff that's, the large vertebrates that are living are things that we have put there in order to eat, and it basically has created a very large tail across these other things. Now, that's just the snapshot of the world today. And why am I saying it's at the breaking point? Well, I mean, I guess you could look at this and already say it's very problematic, but it's at a breaking point because the world population is not done. So we're at the year 2020 right now. Within a couple decades, we're going to be coming real close to 10 billion. And the curve keeps going up past there as well. It's not done at 10 billion. But if you were to just take where we are right now and then add a couple billion to get us close to 10, and were to extrapolate forward the freshwater use, the land use, the continuing poisoning of rivers and streams and shallow ocean, then you just kind of run out of places and water and things to poison. So things are going to need to change in the coming decades. It is basically a requirement. There's not enough space exactly to keep doing things the way that we're doing. So we're going to go jump into that question, because it means that by the year 2050, these things will need to happen. And this is not necessarily even a moral appeal. This is just an appeal to the fact that you can't continue those trends given the physical limits. So we will have a growing population. We will need to get we'll need to use less land in order to get the same number of food tons. And as you see kind of in the shift in the graph here as well, we're going to have a higher percentage of urban population. So how are you going to do that with less rural labor availability? So let's deep dive into the land question real quick. So this is all the land on the planet. This 10% that's glaciers, mostly Antarctica, a little bit of the land around the Arctic Circle. This is the Sahara Desert, all the other deserts. But basically, with the habitable land, then half of that is used for agriculture. All other wild places, forests, shrubland, is less than half. And jumping into the agriculture piece, you'll see that there's a pretty significant imbalance. 77% is going to livestock production of some type. Thus the comment that we've turned the planet into an animal farm. Because look how large this is compared to all other types of use of land on the entire planet. It is the largest. And then 23% is used for cropland that we have any direct part in eating. But if you look at where our calories come from, only 18% is coming from meat and dairy. The great majority is coming from plant-based foods already. So there's a major kind of imbalance or inefficiency that's happening here. And it is using up a huge amount of land to be able to go, drive this inefficiency. Now, going a little bit deeper into this, because there's no point in just laying out a problem and not starting to talk about what it looks like to shift and get some of these solutions. This is a map of what food production is actually, or what crop production is actually used for. And you can see on one end of the spectrum, the greenest green means that every one of those tons of food basically goes to feed a human being. And the purplest purple means that none of that goes and feeds a human being. We're turning it into biofuels, or we're turning it into animal feed. And then, in between, they set yellow as the color. So that's 50-50. Half of the food is going to humans, and then half of it is going to other uses. Now, worldwide, it's about half. About half of the food that we're growing is actually directly eaten by humans. But it means that actually the other half is used, in these other ways. And it varies a lot by geography. So worldwide, you say 50-50, maybe that's not so bad. But in developed areas like the US, Europe broadly, parts of Asia, then actually the great majority, and we'll go into this in more depth in a second, of the food is not eaten by humans. It's used for animal feed, it's used for biofuels. And we can kind of consider this just as a simplification, as a broad category of agricultural behavior. And then the other broad category tends to be these lower resource areas or high population areas where they really, really want to use the acreage that they are tending to feed people. So places like India, sub-Saharan Africa, chunks of China. There are some outliers, like Japan just wants to go grow food, and that's amazing, actually. But they have a high population density in a relatively low area to go grow food. And then there's outliers, though this is palm oil production primarily. Interestingly, over here in South America, you see how purple South America is, because in Brazil and other places, we are basically, once again, pushing mostly, like, there's a misperception that we're cutting down the Amazon rainforest because of these evil logging companies or timber companies. That's not the case. We're mostly burning down the rainforest to go and grow soybean for feed and to graze cattle. So it is not to feed people at all, and it is not for timber even. we don't even bother with the wood. We just burn it down. A bunch of the fires in the Amazon were set by people. It's a pretty wet place. The fires don't just happen out of nowhere. Anyway, with that, we are understanding two broad categories, this kind of purple category, which represents an entire cluster of economic incentives and behaviors, and this green category, which is a different category. So let's go back to those essential questions. How are we going to meet the needs of a growing population? How we're going to use less land in order to get our food tonnage, and how we're going to do that with shifting labor availability. So here's a rough game plan, and we're going to go into each category in some depth. But yeah, we'll just jump into it. But this is the game plan on the purple category. This is the game plan on the green category. All right, so jumping into the purple category. So we're going to take the US as an example of one of those rich nations with a good amount of agricultural production. And this is a graphic that was put together by Bloomberg, where they took all the different uses of land in the US and they kind of clustered them into one block. This is not how they're geographically distributed, but this is the relative sizes of each one of these blocks is the size of how much land we're using for those things. You can see the food that we eat compared to feed of various type. This is feed that we feed to our cows over here. This is feed that we export. This is ethanol and biodiesel production, and we also export some wheat. If you look at the food that we eat, represents less than 20% of the area that we're using to grow. And because of food waste, we waste about 40% of that food. So we're using about 12% of the area that we're using to grow. So not 12% of the whole country, just 12% of the area that we're using to grow, which is this kind of greenish area here, like olive greenish area. About 12% of the area that we are using to grow is actually food that we directly eat. Half of it is basically going to livestock feed, and roughly the same amount that we use to grow food that we eat is going into biofuel production and some materials production, though that's less than 1% at the moment. And I think this sort of diagram, would put into question the narrative that you hear a lot from existing agriculture industry, that we need to keep doing things the way that we're doing them, which is high input monocropping, lots of pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides, in order to quote unquote feed the world. Actually, depending on how you use your land, you can feed the world reasonably easily. It's just that we haven't really prioritized feeding people, at least in high wealth nations. We haven't really prioritized feeding people as a thing that we care to do with the food that we're growing. There's a lot of options if you don't need to do this type of concentration, or you're able to repurpose some of this land. So let's go into some of the things that are going to likely force the repurposing of that land. So first off, we are already at the beginning of a revolution in protein. And 5 years ago, when I first started tracking this, the movement in this space, this was not happening yet. We did not have widespread availability of plant-based alternatives that tasted really good. I mean, there was always, here's a veggie burger, but they were not catching at the level that the most recent wave is. And something like an Impossible Whopper, that's also a symbol of how widely available, and also the price point that you're achieving, where you're getting something that tastes as good as a Whopper. Burger King is willing to go and put it out there, and the sales have actually been reasonably strong. And then this is the Beyond Meat sausage. Now, up and coming is cellular agriculture, and of course, on the left-hand side, this is not the same stuff as meat, but we're basically getting into a territory of taste and price, which allows us to go displace some meat eating at this moment. Cellular agriculture is meat, and this is more emergent. We don't have this widely available yet. But in terms of the fundamentals of the production process, it certainly has the potential to become significantly cheaper, though at the moment it is not. But it has the potential to become significantly cheaper than livestock production as the way that you produce meat. So here's chicken, here's lamb, here's bluefin tuna. And I've basically eaten everything on this page other than this lamb, and it all tastes pretty darn good. So I don't think that we are going to need to hold our nose to move over to these protein alternatives. And cellular agriculture in particular tastes exactly like the meat because it is the meat. Then the third thing that will go change our protein production efficiency is basically, instead of using all of our feed for cows and hogs and chickens, we are going to move some of it to aquaculture, which has just got a better feed conversion ratio. So how many kilograms of feed do you got to put in order to get a kilogram of food? This is kind of an average across aquaculture. You know, you can get down as low as like 1.2 or 1.5, depending on the fish. But, you know, a lot of the world does eat fish and seafood. And we're seeing a lot of alternatives in these other areas. So I think between the three, we could easily imagine a 50% reduction in the growing area that is used to support animal agriculture for protein production. And remember, looking at this graph, this is a much larger area in developed nations than is used to grow the food that we directly eat, which, as per the previous graph, I know this is a lot of data in this presentation, you know, this sort of food is 80% of the food calories already. So just imagine this rapid contraction. Really, it's going to happen over the course of, you know, 10, 15 years. So there will be some time for industry to adapt, but when you scoot backwards and you just look at how, you know, how quickly things have changed over a decade or two, then it'll feel very rapid in retrospect. All right, well, what are all these people going to do? Because there's a lot of growers out there that are growing that feed. There's as many growers out there growing things to produce biofuels as there are that are using that area to go grow crops that we eat. So what happens in the developed world to all of those growers? Well, definitely the fuel production game is over or close to over. I mean, before this time period, before the recent collapse in oil prices, you know, and there is kind of a production race between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. on this front, which is driving the prices lower. So they are artificially low right now. But even before that crisis, biofuel production was expensive. And, you know, there's a paper that you can look up from David Pimentel from Cornell, and basically kind of outlines that 70% more energy is used to go produce ethanol biofuels than we have available from the fuel itself. So just from the pure physics perspective, doesn't sound fantastic, and it's not really fantastic. And price-wise, it's not truly competitive. So as oil prices go lower, then it becomes even less competitive. I think those folks are kind of on the verge of going out of business. Now, even on the oil producer side, they're seeing the writing on the wall. They're seeing mass electrification, you know, because 70+% of oil production goes into transportation fuels. And if we start to electrify, and in the current moment, because we're driving less, then it means that they may not be able to count on oil as their primary source of income, you know, in 10, 15 years from now. So we're already having a major shift over where oil companies are looking to produce materials. So effectively different types of plastics. Now, this is happening at exactly the same time that the world is waking up to the ongoing dangers of plastic pollution, both you know, microplastics as well as, you know, potential human health impacts of plastic broadly. And we're getting relatively large scale bans. So EU has got a large scale ban that's starting to come into effect in 2021, Canada 2021, India 2022. US at the state level So a lot of the West Coast and other regions in the US are also starting to institute these bans. And across all of that, we're talking about a customer base of 2 billion people that are wanting something other than the plastics that oil companies are wanting to produce. And this, I think, presents a unique opportunity. Now, it's not guaranteed that folks in ag are going to step into this opportunity, but it's absolutely a unique opportunity given the nature of the material that people in the ag industry produce. And one other quick look on the plastic side, you know, I started out the presentation talking about the agricultural breaking points. This is kind of where we are on the plastic materials breaking point. This is a graph of all plastic waste ever generated, all the way back to the beginning of plastic production, starting in the early 50s, late 40s. And it has been growing so rapidly that we have produced as much plastic waste since the year 2004 as we did in all of history prior to 2004. So it's a massive acceleration, and it's not one that we are going to be able to continue for the health of the planet in any reasonable way. Now, it really begs the question, like, well, if we're starting to wake up to that and we're instituting the bans, how are you going to do something different? How are you going to do something that does not create that damage? Oh, and one other thing about plastic waste: roughly 50% of this plastic waste is from packaging waste. Now we can step into the potential role of agriculture. So agriculture, this is a cornstarch plastic, right? So if you're a corn grower and you have been using your stuff to go do corn ethanol, then there you go. Agricultural production, even the waste products, so the crop residuals basically have tons of cellulose, and cellulose is the primary material that is used in cellophane, thus the name. And cellophane represents a thin film, clear, colorable, and biodegradable option that could be used to displace a lot of things. And these are all different types of packaging and material production where you're getting way higher value for your good in terms of a kilogram of production, market value for the thing that you ultimately sell. And they're all based off of grown materials. So I think there is a world, though it's not guaranteed that we will step into it, where we basically address this problem and we close this gap through the agriculture industry. And it also gives an out for the folks that are now dead-ending in the biofuel space and want to stay kind of close to some sort of industrial production as opposed to just selling food. All right. And then the last reason that I think this is possible before we shift over to the discussion of the entire other category, the green category, is the farming population, and this is not just the US, it's slightly different in other developed nations, but the US is not a bad marker of this, is pretty darn close to retirement. So if you were to imagine a graph of the age distribution of a profession for most professions, you would think, well, it's the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. That's most of the range where people are employed. Well, this is basically the average age of the producer owners, and you can see that the chart doesn't start until 56, because basically everybody is existing in this range between 56 up through 60, with the average age being 58.3 at the moment. So you look at something like this and you say, well, look, we have a two prong change in labor. One is that in a lot of these developed areas, current agricultural owners are getting old enough that they're within 10 years of retirement. This is happening at exactly the same time that there's radical shifts that are making their previous way of growing not economically viable anymore. And this, from the talent perspective, maybe says, well, there's a real possibility of a phase shift moment And if you throw in there the actual ecological need and the limits that we're going to be hitting with expanded population growth, there's a real moment that can come together around this in the next 10 years. We're going to keep on going. So over to the other category, lower resource areas. And just a quick refresher, these are areas like sub-Saharan Africa, India, places with lower average incomes, and a lot of farmers out there for that reason. So you can see also the size of farms that they're running are way smaller. So we got lots of the, between Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, it's 91% of farms are below 10 hectares. You see in Americas and Europe, that's the places where the large farms are. There's about 500 million of those farms, and there's 2 billion people that are employed in that way. And they basically work with very low annual incomes on their farms, and they're very close to the poverty rate. And a lot of these folks live on $1 or $2 a day personally. All right, so what are we going to do in these areas? Well, we can explore leapfrog economics, just like what we saw in cell phones to go replace landline, leapfrog landline communications, or what we're seeing in solar and in some of these areas to leapfrog, a large-scale power grid. Then there's tools that we can look at to go explore the leapfrog thesis for the agricultural production and distribution side. But we need to be focused, given the financial situation, on things where on the supply side, we have been driving down the cost and better efficiency for that cost pretty significantly, typically because of technology. That on the finance side, that there's ways to go arrange it where it's financeable to people that live on $2 a day. And if they invest any of their money in it, it needs to immediately translate to economic gain. So a couple potential areas, and this is all very nascent. There's no guarantees that this will be the case. But if you look at sensor-supported precision agriculture, this has the benefit of having potentially driving down inputs pretty significantly. Way less water use, way less fertilizer use. Both are very high-cost things for folks that are smallholder farmers. And the thing you would need to figure out here is the financing and installation model. But in terms of the savings that they could potentially get because they move over to this, and the efficiency and the dependability of production that they get per acre, then it's worth exploring. We also have, and I'm pointing at things that also are on a technology curve, because basically we are getting better at precision agriculture every year. So both the efficacy that you're getting and the efficacy that you're getting per cost should be improving. Same sort of thing with drone-based precision application of specialty chemicals. The drone technology, the sensing technology gets better every year. There's no year where our ability to use machine vision to go understand different crop conditions is getting worse. There's no year where our ability to go target apply, agricultural chemistry that goes supports, addresses those situations is getting worse. So I don't think we're at the point yet for this helping developing world farmers yet, but you can see we're on a curve that in a couple years where you can imagine they pay a small, couple bucks for a service to come by and help them. And we are at the point where this is already happening. So basically, Uber for tractors and heavy equipment. Since a lot of these folks right now do not have a lot of mechanical agricultural tools, there's a lot of work that's being done by hand, then you can imagine them not owning the tractor or heavy equipment, but effectively hiring a tractor driver or hiring the tractor itself in order to go use it during a couple labor-intensive times in the year, planting, harvesting, that sort of thing. So that's already happening. And there's a number of services that are going out there. And all of these have some of the characteristics of leapfrog economics and aggregate improvements of technological curves. All right. So really what is laid out, and this is a super boring all text slide, but there's two big paths that are being kind of that are possible for the folks in these low resource conditions. We can either push them down the conventional agricultural practice path, which is efficient production of monocrops. It's not great for soil health. It has pretty high input costs. You get a lot of agricultural runoffs. We basically reproduce a lot of the problems of eutrophication, reproduce a lot of the problems of soil health that we are having in developed nations right now. And you end up being tied to big agribusiness, whether it's for your GMO seeds or for your for your Roundup, for your fungicides. A second path is we could encourage soil regenerative practices. We could, people could get good value for acre by doing multi-cropping instead of, efficient monocropping. But the reason that I'm pushing back on monocropping as opposed to and pushing multi-cropping is think about all these producers in the developed nations where their monocrops are becoming less valuable because we are shifting protein production and fuel production and material production in a different way. They're going to be competing on the global market with these folks that are now trying to produce monocrops. I don't really think it's realistic that folks in that are just up and coming working on 2.5 acres in Kenya are going to be able to go compete with that. So it is better for them to do multi-cropping, sell a range of goods in their local markets and also have a range of goods that they can eat. And this is a little bit of a stretch. We don't know whether this will emerge or not, but we are caring more about decarbonization. We're talking about carbon markets of where we pay $20, $30 per a ton of sequestered carbon. And good soil management does drive carbon sequestration. So for a 1 hectare plot, then these folks could make another $120 per year. And these are families that have $720 to $1,000 in annual discretionary spend. So $120 for them for a benefit from carbon farming may be really material. In the US, less so, and a lot of other areas less so, unless your crop is extremely unprofitable and you just want to make some money anyhow, and wouldn't be against it if more farmers did carbon farming. But this is all contingent on some market for carbon coming up in the next couple decades. Lastly is path 2 requires more labor, but in the developing world, we have a younger labor pool, and it is possible for them to go do this. Now, one more thing which may reset all the other things, but at minimum, it's going to have an important impact on the other things, is a lot of our food production for crop production may move in the direction of high density sunlight grown automated greenhouse agriculture. And this is Nature Fresh in Israel. These are Dutch greenhouses. This is Iron Ox. And basically, the reason for sunlight grown as opposed to vertical farms require a lot of grow lighting. Well, the OpEx on grow lighting makes vertical farms pretty darn expensive. And if you can get this done with sunlight, then you can get to way more competitive unit economics, even competitive with outdoor agriculture. And then something like the Iron Ox approach doesn't need to be Iron Ox, but people in this vein, the mechanization of a number of the agricultural tasks means that you can bring down the labor costs as well. So now you're getting high grow density. You're not needing to go pay for the energy to grow the plants because it's coming from the sun. You're not needing to pay much for labor because it's becoming automated and robotic. And you will be able to get to a sort of production per food ton, which is highly competitive, even with highly optimized outdoor farming in developed nations. So this is a thing that is going to be kind of a undercurrent that will be rising and affecting the other two categories that I've been talking about. Exactly the speed that it rises, big question mark. But in conclusion, because I definitely want to go take some questions, we're covering a bunch of ground. We've been changing food production a lot. where there's going to be a big shift where we go and address the very high footprint way that we've been doing proteins. And on the material side, we will be looking at, I think there'll be some set of the agricultural sector that will go address some of the material issues that we're having with the kind of plastics collision course between banning and a bunch of oil companies not having a next thing to do with their materials. All right. So I guess I'll just escape that mode so I can see people now. We're going to go to Q&A.
Great. Thanks everyone for your questions. So our top question at the moment is from Gerhard, and he's asking, could regenerative farming, e.g. intermittent grazing, no-till et al., combine the benefits of both forms of farming, animal and crop production, by avoiding the downsides?
Yeah, so absolutely. Animals as part of soil regenerative agriculture can be extremely effective. And in my presentation, I didn't presume that we're taking livestock production to zero. I presumed we're taking it down by half. So that means there's still a bunch of livestock in the world. It means, I don't know, still a lot of the biomass is poultry and cows, but in terms of land use, it basically gives back 20% of the habitable land on the planet if we can bring that down by half.
Great. Our next question is from Andrew, and he asks, do you think there's a role of more local farming practices and shorter supply chains in the future of agriculture? If so, how do you think about this with regard to investment?
So, yes, the stuff that I ended with, like, intensive, greenhouse automation, yeah, that absolutely can reduce food miles tremendously, because greenhouses can have climate control across a very large range of physical settings and reliably produce food pretty much wherever they're sited. So yeah, I do think that if we move a significant amount of production in that direction, then it will also be quote unquote more local. It may not be like local in that strawberries may not grow in Minnesota, but inside of a greenhouse situation, they can. So they're not endemically local species-wise, but they are functionally local in terms of where they were grown.
Great. All right. Next question is from Franco. He asks, do you see capital and R&D flowing towards improving current food sources as much as it is flowing towards alternative foods?
Well, so historically, no. I mean, what we've mostly done for existing food sources is just maximize production per dollar, and that has been expense at soil health and nutrient density and a bunch of other things. I think if you can get to your food production targets on less land, then we can absolutely spend a lot more effort focusing on nutrient density and health of the food that we're growing, as opposed to just maximizing output.
Great. This question's from Tim, and he asks, I think this was in relation to the Bloomberg graphic, what portion is arid grassland that is not suitable for modern agriculture?
So you just need to go look at, the map of the US. Like, you can see we are grazing land, we're grazing land that is arid land as well. But when you say, not suitable for modern agriculture, once again, think about greenhouse automation. You could put the Israel farms are in the middle of a desert. So I'm not exactly sure, exactly what the territory is now for suitable for agriculture if you can site stuff in the middle of a desert.
Great. All right, I think we are out of time. So Tim, if you are around to answer a couple more questions in the comments on the sidebar chat, we'll try to add some answers there for you. But everyone, please head on over to the first panel of the summit coming up next on ag tech investing for the future. And thank you again, Tom, for all of your time and for joining us again this year at the summit.
Thank you.